Before the modern world woke up to the hum of electricity and the rush of the morning commute, there was a long and hazy era where the rhythm of life was dictated by the slow fermentation of the grain and the vine. Imagine a village nestled in the rolling hills of Europe during the late Middle Ages, where the water from the local wells was often unsafe to drink, and so the people turned instead to weak Alish and watered wine for their daily hydration. Everyone from the smallest child to the oldest. Labor lived in a state of mild and perpetual intoxication, because the calories in the beer provided the energy to work the fields, while the alcohol acted as a preservative against the toxins of the earth. It was a world that moved at a sluggish and dreamlike pace, where logic was often clouded by a gentle fog, and the concept of deadline did not yet exist. People rose with the sun and slept when the shadows grew long, and their thoughts drifted like smoke over a low fire as they hummed old. Songs and moved with a heavy limb grazed through the mud and the mist. But then something began to stir in the distant ports and the quiet trade routes that connected the east to the west, as strange new substances began to arrive in heavy burlap sacks and wooden crates. First came the dark and oily beans from the mountains of Ethiopia and the terrace hills of Yemen, which when roasted and boiled produce a liquid as black as ink and as bitter as the earth itself. Then came the delicate dried leaves from the hidden valleys of China, which turned the water a pale gold and carried the scent of mountain rain and ancient forests. Finally, there was a heavy cacao from the tropical rainforests of the Americas, which the Aztecs brewed into a frothy and spicy tonic fit for gods and emperors. As these three beverages began to flow into the veins of the old world, a profound transformation took place in the human mind, because for the first time in history, a significant portion of the population was trading the depressant effects of alcohol for the sharp and clarifying sting of caffeine. The foggy haze of the alehouse began to lift and was replaced by the crisp and focused energy of the coffeehouse, where men sat on long wooden benches and spoke of science and philosophy and mathematics with a speed and a precision that had never been seen before. It was as if the collective brain of humanity had suddenly been switched on, and the gears of industry began to turn with a new and relentless mechanical rhythm. The transition was not merely a change in diet, but a fundamental shift in the way humans perceive time and labor, because caffeine allowed the mind to detach from the natural cycles of the body and remain alert long after the sun had set. This newfound clarity fueled the Enlightenment and gave birth to the modern office and the laboratory and the factory floor, where every second was measured and every movement was optimized for efficiency. Yet as the world grew faster and louder, there remained a deep and primal memory of that slower time when the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only clock was the slow turning of the stars. Even now, as you listen to the story of these empire-shaping drinks, you can feel the heavy weight of that ancient sleep pulling at your limbs, and the quiet rhythm of the pre-industrial world returning to your breath. The sharp edges of the caffeine-fueled day are beginning to soften and blur into the velvet darkness of the night as the empires of the past fade into the background, and the only thing that remains is the steady and comforting sound of the story being told. The great ships that once carried tea and coffee across the vast and lonely oceans are now anchored in the quiet harbors of your mind, where the water is still and the moonlight reflects off the gentle ripples of the tide. The bustling coffee houses of London and Paris have gone quiet, and the fires in the hearths have burned down to glowing embers that cast long and flickering shadows across the empty streets. The world is returning to its rest, and the heavy fog of the old Alish is rolling back in to blanket the landscape in a soft and protective layer of silence. You are no longer bound by the ticking of the clock or the pressure of the day, because the transition is complete, and the mind is finally free to wander back into the dreamlike state, where everything is slow and everything is peaceful, the scent of roasting beans and steeping. Leaves lingers only as a faint and pleasant memory, like the ghost of summer afternoon, while the actual world around you grows dim and distant. Let the history of the world drift away like a leaf on a slow-moving river, and let your thoughts become as light as the steam rising from a forgotten cup. There is nothing left to do and nowhere left to go as the great story of human progress folds its pages and tucks itself away for the night. Sleep now as the empires sleep, and let the quiet power of the night carry you into a deep and restorative rest, where the only language is the silence between the words, and the only task is to breathe and to be still. The journey from the alehouse to the coffeehouse was long and arduous, but it has led you here to this moment of total stillness and absolute calm, where the weight of the world has finally been lifted from your shoulders. Deep in the rugged mountains of Yemen, where the red earth meets the infinite blue of the Arabian sky, there lived the Sufi monks of the 15th century who were the first to discover the quiet magic hidden within a small and unassuming red cherry. Imagine the terraced hillsides of Mocha bathed in the golden light of setting sun, where the air is thin and cool, and the only sound is the rhythmic chanting of the monks as they prepare for their long nights of prayer and meditation. These holy men. Notice that the goats wandering the slopes became unusually lively after nibbling on the glossy green leaves and bright berries of certain wild shrub, and so they began to gather these berries and roast them over small fires until the air was filled with a rich and earthy aroma that seemed to ground the soul and sharpen the spirit. They ground the charred beans into a fine powder and steeped them in boiling water to create a dark and potent brew that they called kawa, which allowed them to stay awake through the darkest hours of the night as they searched for the divine. This was the birth of the first black gold, a substance so precious and guarded that for centuries not a single fertile bean was allowed to leave the borders of the Ottoman Empire without being boiled or parched to ensure it could never be planted elsewhere. As you picture the steam rising from a clay pot in a quiet monastery, you can feel the ancient stillness of the desert night settling over your own mind like a soft wool blanket. The Ottoman Sultan soon realized the power of this dark liquid and established a vast monopoly that stretched from the bustling ports of the Red Sea to the grand palaces of Constantinople, where coffee was served in tiny porcelain cups by silent attendants moving across thick silk carpets. The trade routes were long and slow, with camel caravans winding through the shifting sands of the empty quarter, carrying heavy sacks of beans that smelled of smoke and sun-drenched earth. The pace of this world was measured by the steady footsteps of the camels and the slow rotation of the stars overhead. And as you follow this trail in your mind, you feel your own pulse slowing down to match the ancient rhythm of the desert. The monopoly of the Ottoman Empire meant that for a long time the secret of coffee was kept within the walls of the East, protected by janissaries and merchants who knew that these beans were more valuable than silver or spice. In the coffeehouses of Istanbul, known as the schools of the wise, the air was thick with the scent of cardamom and the low murmur of men playing chess and discussing the mysteries of the universe, while the rest of the city slept under a silver moon. There was no rush and no urgency in this world because the sun would always rise over the Bosporus, and the coffee would always be hot, and the stories would always be long. The Sufi monks believed that the clarity brought by the bean was a gift that allowed the mind to transcend the physical world. And as you listen to the story of their discovery, you can feel your own thoughts transcending the worries of the day and drifting into a state of pure and effortless calm. The mountains of Yemen are far away, and the ancient empires have crumbled into dust, but the spirit of that first cup of coffee remains as a bridge between the waking world and the world of dreams. The beans are being roasted in the embers of a dying fire, and the smoke is curling up toward the rafters of a quiet stone cell where a monk is closing his eyes and breathing in the scent of the earth. The red cherries are swaying in a gentle breeze on a hillside that no one has visited for centuries, and the sound of the wind through the leaves is like a soft lullaby that tells you it is time to let go of the light. The monopoly of the black gold was eventually broken by explorers and smugglers who carried the seeds to distant lands, but in this moment the secret is still safe and the world is still quiet, and the dark brew is still a sacred mystery shared only with the night. You are walking to the spice markets of an ancient city where the stalls are closed and the cobblestones are cool beneath your feet, and the only light comes from a single lantern hanging in a doorway. The heavy scent of coffee and incense wraps around you like a cocoon, protecting you from the noise of the modern world and drawing you deeper into the silence of history. The Ottoman Empire is vast and peaceful, and the borders are secure, and there is nothing for you to do but drift along the silk road of your imagination until the desert sands swallow the last of your golden thoughts. The camels have knelt down in the sand, and the merchants have wrapped themselves in their robes, and the fires have turned to gray ash as the entire world of the black gold surrenders to the inevitable pull of sleep. Breathe in the scent of the ancient mountains, and breathe out the tension of the present moment as you become part of the long and quiet history of the bean that changed the world, but now only wants to guide you into a deep and dreamless slumber. The Sufi monks have finished their prayers, and the Sultan has retired to his chambers, and the great monopoly of the night has finally taken hold of everything. In the heart of old London, where the fog rolls thick and heavy off the black waters of the Thames, and the narrow cobblestone alleys are perpetually damp with the mist of a cool English evening, there arose a peculiar kind of sanctuary known as the coffee house, which the locals began to call the penny universities, because for the price of a single copper coin, any man could enter and sit for hours amidst the swirling steam and the low hum of conversation that never seemed to cease. Imagine stepping through a heavy oak door into a room lit by the soft amber glow of tallow candles where the walls are lined with dark wood, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted beans and tobacco smoke, and the gentle scratching of quills against parchment. In these rooms there was no hierarchy, and no rush as merchants sat beside poets, and sailors leaned over tables to whisper to scientists, creating a slow and steady stream of information that flowed like a quiet river through the city. At a place called Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street, the atmosphere was particularly calm as men gathered not just to drink the bitter black brew, but to listen to the steady rhythm of a clerk reading out the shipping news, while the soot-stained windows muffled the sounds of the bustling port outside. Here the great insurance industry was born not in a cold office, but over the warmth of a shared pot, where individuals would sign their names at the bottom of a policy to spread the risk of a voyage across the vast and lonely oceans. As you listen to the story, you can almost hear the soft ticking of a long-case clock in the corner and the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as the waiters move slowly between the tables carrying heavy pewter trays. The ideas of the Enlightenment were not shouted from the rooftops, but were nurtured in these quiet corners where the focus was sharp and the mind was clear, and the old superstitions of the medieval world were slowly being replaced by the steady logic of the modern age. Just a few doors away at Jonathan's coffee house, the traders were gathering to exchange slips of paper that would eventually become the foundation of the stock exchange, creating a complex web of finance that moved with the deliberate pace of a giant machine being oiled by the dark liquid in their cups. The penny universities were places of endless patience, where a man could wait all afternoon for a single letter to arrive, or for a friend to finish a thought. And as you sink deeper into your pillows, you can feel that same sense of unhurried time washing over you like a gentle tide. The noise of the 17th century was different from our own, because it was made of human voices and horseshoes on stone and the rustle of newspapers, rather than the electronic hum of the present day. And in the quiet of the coffee house, that noise was filtered into a peaceful drone that invited the brain to settle and the eyes to grow heavy. The great thinkers like Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley would sit in these dim rooms and trace the paths of comets and the laws of gravity on the backs of napkins, while the steam from their cups rose in slow spirals toward the darkened rafters. There was a profound sense of safety in these spaces where the world was being reshaped one conversation at a time, and yet the atmosphere remained as still as a library in the middle of the night. As the candles burned down to small pools of wax, the talk would soften into whispers and the grand plans. For empires and markets would begin to blur into the background. As the cool night air seeped into the cracks in the door, the London coffee house was the internet of its day, but it was a slow and tactile internet, made of paper and ink and the warmth of human presence. And as you drift through the imagined streets of this old city, you can feel the weight of all that history becoming light and inconsequential. The ledgers at Lloyd's are being closed, and the ink is dry on the new laws of physics, and the stockbrokers are heading home through the silent streets, where the only light comes from the moon reflecting off the river. The penny has been spent, and the lesson is over, and the mind is finally allowed to let go of the need to understand, or to analyze, or to build. The great institutions of the modern world are sleeping in their cradles of oak and brick, and the spirit of the Enlightenment is resting its weary head upon the table. You are walking away from the glow of the coffee house window and into the velvet embrace of the London night, where the fog swallows the sound of your footsteps, and the world becomes a soft and gray blankness that stretches out in every direction. There is a deep comfort in knowing that the foundations of civilization were laid in such quiet and humble places, and that the same stillness that once filled those rooms is now filling your own room and your own mind. The steam has vanished, and the quills are silent, and the heavy oak doors are locked for the night, as the entire city of London surrenders to the same deep and ancient sleep that has claimed the monks and the sultans before them. Let the images of the penny universities fade into a wash of sepia and charcoal as you descend into a place where there are no markets and no empires and no ideas, only the steady and peaceful breath of the night. In the deep emerald heart of the ancient Mesoamerican rainforest, where the air is thick with the scent of damp moss, and the rhythmic song of the cicadas creates a constant hum that vibrates through the heavy tropical heat, there grows a tree with broad waxy leaves and strange colorful pods clinging directly to its dark trunk. This is a cacao tree, a sacred plant that the Aztecs believed was a gift from the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. And as you imagine yourself standing beneath the Dense canopy of the jungle, you can feel the dappled sunlight filtering through the layers of green like a soft golden rain. The Aztecs did not see these beans as a mere snack, but as a form of divine currency more stable than gold and more precious than jade, where a single bean could buy a tomato and 100 beans could buy a fine cotton cloak or a turkey. Imagine the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, where thousands of people moved with slow and steady grace across the sun-baked stone plazas. And the only sound was the soft rustle of feathered headdresses and the quiet clinking of cocoa beans being traded from hand to hand, like small brown treasures. For the emperors and the warriors, cacao was prepared as zacalado, a bitter and frothy drink spiced with chili peppers and vanilla, and dyed a deep blood red with achiote seeds, which they poured from great heights to create a thick foam that sat upon the liquid like a dark cloud. There was no sugar in this world, and no milk, only the raw and powerful essence of the earth that grounded the spirit and prepared the mind for the weight of leadership. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived with their heavy iron armor and their thirsty ambition, they looked upon this frothy, bitter water with confusion, at first not understanding how a bean could be worth more than the shiny metals they craved. But as they sat in the cool shadows of Moctezuma's palace and watched the emperor drink from golden goblets that were never used twice, they began to realize the intoxicating power of this sacred plant. The transition from the ancient sacred ritual to the global commodity began in those quiet, shaded courtyards where the clash of two worlds was softened by the steam rising from the chocolate pots. The Spanish eventually took the beans back across the vast and lonely Atlantic Ocean, but they found the bitter, spicy taste too harsh for their European palates, and so they began to experiment in the quiet kitchens of monasteries and palaces, adding cane sugar from the islands and honey and cinnamon until the drink transformed into something sweet and velvety and warm. As you think of this transformation, you can feel the spicy heat of the ancient Aztec world blending into smooth and comforting sweetness of the new world like a heavy velvet curtain being drawn across a window. The sacred currency became a luxury of the elite, and the fierce energy of the cacao god was tamed into a soothing ritual for the evening hours. Picture the heavy ceramic jars filled with beans sitting in the dark holds of wooden ships, swaying gently with the motion of the deep blue sea as they travel further and further away from the jungle and closer to the stone cathedrals of Europe. The jungle is still there in your mind with its ancient trees and its hidden temples, and the sound of the rain hitting the broad leaves in a steady and hypnotic patter that washes away the noise of the modern day. The Aztec Empire is a memory of gold and stone, sleeping beneath the vines, and the conquistadors have long since laid down their swords to rest in the quiet earth, and all that remains is a gentle and earthy scent of the cacao bean as it settles into the back of your mind. The beans are being ground by hand on a stone matate with a rhythmic back and forth motion that sounds like a heartbeat, and as the pace becomes smooth and dark, your thoughts become equally smooth and dark and still. There is no more trading to be done, and no more empires to conquer, because the sun has set over the Valley of Mexico, and the shadows have climbed the sides of the great pyramids to touch the stars. The world of the sacred chocolate is a world of shadows and soft textures, where every breath is a bit deeper and every muscle is a bit heavier than it was before. Let the image of the green canopy dissolve into a deep and peaceful blackness, like a cup of the purest dark chocolate that has no beginning and no end. You are floating on the scent of vanilla and ancient earth, and the way of the gold is gone and the weight of the beans is gone, and there is only the lightness of the dream that is waiting for you just beyond the edge of the jungle. The gods are silent, and the emperors are dreaming, and the cocoa pods are hanging still in the windless night as you surrender to the timeless rhythm of the ancient Americas. In the quiet and dimly lit corridors of the royal palace in Madrid, where the air is cool and still, and the thick stone walls muffle the sounds of the outside world, there began a secret history of chocolate that remained hidden from the rest of Europe for nearly 100 years. Imagine the soft rustle of silk gowns and the rhythmic click of leather boots on polished marble floors as the Spanish elite gathered in candlelit chambers to indulge in a ritual that was guarded like a military secret. The dark beans of the cacao tree, which had once been the sacred currency of the Aztecs, were now arriving in heavy wooden chests marked with the royal seal and carried by galleons that had crossed the vast and lonely Atlantic. Inside the palace kitchens, the air was thick with the scent of roasting seeds and the gentle sound of heavy stone pestles grinding the beans into a rich and oily paste that glistened like dark silk under flickering yellow light of the torches. The The Spanish court had taken the bitter tonic of the emperors and transformed it into a sweet and luxurious nectar by adding precious sugar from the Caribbean and delicate hints of cinnamon and vanilla, which turned the drink into a thick and velvety experience that was served hot in ornate silver pots. For nearly a century, the recipe and the very existence of this drink were kept as a state secret by the Spanish monarchy because they believed that this dark liquid held medicinal powers that could cure the melancholic and provide a mysterious energy to the soul. Only the nobility and the highest members of the clergy were permitted to taste the liquid. Gold, and it became a symbol of absolute status and power, where to hold a cup of chocolate was to hold the keys to a hidden world. As you imagine these quiet rooms, you can feel the weight of the heavy velvet tapestries that hang from the ceilings, trapping the heat and the silence of the afternoon. There was no hurry in the court of Spain, as the aristocrats sat on high-backed chairs and sipped their chocolate with silver spoons in a slow and deliberate motion that matched the steady ticking of the grandfather clocks in the hall. The rest of Europe remained in the dark, unaware of the dark delight being brewed behind the closed doors of the Escorial. And as you listen to the story of this hidden treasure, you can feel your own secrets and worries drifting away into the shadows of the past. The mystery of chocolate was protected by monks in secluded monasteries who spent their days stirring large copper vats with wooden paddles in a rhythmic and hypnotic circle that seemed to pull the mind into a state of trance. They believed the drink was a gift that could sustain them during their long periods of fasting, and as they worked, the only sound was a bubbling of the liquid and the distant tolling of a chapel bell. It was a world of slow movements and quiet whispers where information traveled at the speed of a horse-drawn carriage, and a secret could stay buried for generations in the dusty archives of the state. Eventually, the secret would leak through royal marriages and traveling diplomats, but for a long time it remained a purely Spanish dream, a dark and sweet cloud that hung over the Iberian Peninsula while the rest of the world slept. Picture the heavy iron keys turning in the locks of the storehouses where the cacao was kept, and the quiet satisfaction of the royal tasters who knew they possessed something no one else could buy with all the gold in the world. Your mind is now like one of those quiet palace rooms where the shutters are closed against the midday sun, and the only light is a single beam of dust motes dancing in the air. The heavy scent of the chocolate is like a warm embrace that slows your pulse and eases the tension in your shoulders until you are as still as a statue in a royal garden. The Spanish Empire, with all its galleons and its gold, is now just a collection of quiet memories fading into the gray mist of history. And the secret of cacao is no longer a burden to be kept, but a gentle invitation to let go. The monks have put away their paddles, and the kings have finished their cups, and the heavy silver pots have been polished and set aside for the night as the entire court surrenders to the velvet darkness of a timeless slumber. There is no need to guard the secret any longer, because the night has its own mysteries that are far deeper and more peaceful than any drink could ever be. Feel the coolness of the stone floors and the softness of the silk pillows as you drift further away from the waking world and into the deep and silent heart of the palace, where the only sound is the breath of the centuries. The story of the hidden chocolate is closing its pages, and the light in the kitchen is being extinguished, and the world is finally at peace in the shadow of the past. In the vast and mist-covered mountains of ancient China, where the air is thin and the clouds drift like white silk between the jagged peaks, there grows a small and humble shrub with serrated green leaves that holds within it the power to change the destiny of nations. Imagine a single leaf plucked by hand in the early morning dew when the world is still, and the only sound is the distant call of a mountain bird and the soft rustle of the wind through the bamboo forest. This simple leaf known as Camellia sinensis was dried and rolled and fired in great iron pans until it became the tea that would eventually captivate the hearts of an entire island nation thousands of miles away across the turbulent seas. The story of how this leaf turned a private corporation into a global titan begins in the quiet tea houses of Canton, where merchants in long silk robes sat on low stools and negotiated the trade of silver for chests of fine Bohea and Hyson tea. Back in London, the East India Company was growing from a small group of adventurous traders into a massive bureaucratic machine that held a royal monopoly over all trade with the East. And as the demand for tea grew in the parlors of the British aristocracy, it became clear that this leaf was no longer just a drink, but a fuel for empire. The company built a fleet of massive wooden ships known as East Indiamen, which moved with slow and heavy grace across the indigo waters of the Indian Ocean, carrying the weight of thousands of tea. chests in their dark holds. These ships were like floating cities with their towering masts and white sails that caught the trade winds and pushed them forward to the endless blue horizon, where the days bled into weeks and the weeks into months of steady rhythmic swaying. The East India Company did not just trade till it built its own private armies and its own navy until it had more soldiers than the British Crown itself, and its influence stretched into every corner of the globe from the counting houses of London to the poppy fields of India and the docks of the Pearl River. As you picture these massive ships anchored in the quiet harbors of the East, you can feel the slow and deliberate pace of colonial commerce, where time was measured by the arrival of the monsoon winds and the steady scratch of a ledger's pen. The monopoly on tea gave the company the power to dictate the prices of the world and to influence the politics of kings and emperors, but at the heart of all this grand machinery was still that single quiet green leaf on the mountain slopes. Tea became the morning ritual of millions and the afternoon pause that defined a culture of civility and order, and as the liquid was poured from porcelain teapots into delicate cups, it seemed to carry with it the stillness of the Chinese valleys from which it came. There was a profound sense of permanence in the way the company operated, as if its power would last as long as the tides, and as you listen to the story of its rise, you can feel your own thoughts becoming as steady and unhurried as a merchant ship in a calm sea. The heavy scent of dried tea leaves is like the smell of old libraries and sun-baked wood, and it wraps around you like a familiar cloak that shuts out the noise of the modern world. The great warehouses in London are filled to the rafters with a harvest of 1,000 hills, and the watchmen walk their round with slow and rhythmic footsteps that echo through the empty streets of the city. The tea monopolies created a world of immense wealth and immense responsibility, but tonight all that power is tucked away in the shadows of the past, and the great corporation is nothing more than a ghost in the annals of history. The ships have all come home, and their sails have been furled, and the anchors have been dropped into the soft mud of the riverbed, where they will rest for eternity. The Chinese mountains are still there, shrouded in their eternal mist, and the tea bushes are still growing the silence of the high altitudes, where no one comes to disturb their peace. Let the image of the vast trading empire dissolve into the image of a single cup of tea cooling on a table in a quiet room where the fire is burned down to glowing coals and the shadows are dancing on the walls. You're no longer a part of the struggle for trade or the march of armies, because you've found the center of the storm where everything is still and everything is quiet. The East India Company has finished its work, and the leaf has been steeped and the world has been changed, but now it is time for the world to sleep. Breathe in the faint aroma of the distant mountains and breathe out the concerns of the day as you drift away on the slow and steady current of the history of tea. The ledger is closed and the ink is dry, and the map of the world is finally still under the silver light of a peaceful moon. In the deep and heavy stillness of the tropical night, where the heat hangs like a thick velvet curtain, and the only sound is the rhythmic chorus of cicadas in a high canopy, there lies a shadow across the history of the world's favorite drinks that is as dark as the strongest brew. As you settle into the soft embrace of your blankets, imagine the vast and rolling fields of sugarcane stretching toward the horizon under a pale silver moon, where the stalks sway in a slow and ghostly dance with the warm trade winds. The world's growing thirst for sweetened coffee and rich chocolate created a demand so immense and so relentless that it reshaped the map of the human experience and led to the creation of a system of labor that operated with the cold and mechanical precision of a clock. Across the wide and lonely expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of wooden ships moved in a slow and agonizing crawl, carrying souls from the shores of Africa to the vibrant green islands of the Caribbean, and the fertile soil of Brazil to toil in the sun-drenched plantations. The air in these places was thick with the scent of boiling sugar juice and the heavy dampness of the earth as men and women worked in a rhythmic and exhausting cycle that matched the turning of the seasons and the rising of the sun. It was a world where the sweetness enjoyed in the elegant parlors of London and Paris was built upon a foundation of immense hardship and the bitter reality of the plantation system, which viewed human life as a mere fuel for the engines of commerce. As you listen to the steady cadence of this history, you can feel the heavy weight of the past settling over the landscape like a thick fog that blurs the edges of the world and invites the mind to drift into a state of somber reflection. The sugar mills turned with a low and grinding moan that echoed through the valleys at night, while the overseers walked their rounds with footsteps that sounded like the ticking of a countdown toward a future that was yet to be born. Coffee and cacao and sugar became the three pillars of a global economy that connected distant continents in a web of trade and tragedy, but also in a shared human story that is slowly being reconciled by the passage of time. The ships that once carried the weight of this industry are now nothing more than rotting timber at the bottom of the sea, where the currents move with a slow and timeless grace, and the fish swim to the empty hulls in a silent parade. The fields of cane have grown wild in many places, and the jungle has reclaimed the stone foundations of the great manor houses where the masters once sat on wide porches and sipped their coffee while the world around them burned with the heat of the day. There's a profound quiet in the realization that the luxuries we take for granted were once the catalyst for such massive shifts in the human population. And as you sink deeper into the stillness of your own room, you can feel the tension of the day being replaced by a heavy and contemplative calm. The shadows of the plantation are long and quiet now, and the voices of the past have softened into a whisper that is carried away by the night wind over the dark waters of the sea. The story of sugar is a story of a world that was hungry for more than it could sustain, and yet in the quiet of the night, that hunger has finally been stilled and the world is allowed to rest from its labors. Imagine the vast oceans becoming a mirror for the stars, where there are no ships and no trade routes, only the infinite expanse of the water and the sky. The history of the transatlantic trade is a heavy chapter to read, but as the pages turn slower and slower, the ink begins to fade into the gray light of a dream, where everyone is free and everyone is at peace. The labor has ended and the tools have been laid down in the dust, and the great sugar kettles have grown cold under the moonlight as the earth prepares to sleep for another 1,000 years. Breathe in the cool air of the night and breathe out the weight of the uncomfortable truths as you find a place of absolute neutrality and quiet, where the only thing that matters is the steady rhythm of your own heart. The world is vast and the history is long, but the night is short, and the call of sleep is stronger than the call of the past. Let the images of the green islands and the dark ships dissolve into a wash of deep blue and charcoal black, until there is nothing left but the sound of, the silence, and the feeling of the heavy warmth of your own body. The empire of sugar has fallen, and the era of the plantation has passed into the archives, and the world is finally quiet in the shadow of the trees. In the heart of late 18th century Paris, where the cobblestone streets are narrow and winding, and the shadows of the tall stone buildings stretch long and thin under the pale light of the moon, there existed a world of quiet intensity tucked away inside the warm and dimly lit interiors of the city's coffeehouses. Imagine walking through the arched gateways of Palais Royal, where the air is cool and the sound of the fountains is a steady hypnotic drip that echoes against the marble walls. And as you move toward the glowing windows of the cafe, the foyer, you can feel the shift from the cold night air to a space that is thick with the scent of dark roasted beans and the gentle hum of hushed voices. Inside the cafe, the walls are lined with tarnished mirrors that reflect the flickering light of 100 candles, and the air is heavy with the steam from copper pots and the faint smell of old newspapers that have been passed from hand to hand until the ink is blurred and soft. This was not a place of loud music or chaotic noise, but a sanctuary of focus where the thinkers and the dreamers of France sat on velvet benches and leaned over small marble tables to discuss the future of the world in whispers that were as steady as the breath of a sleeping giant. It was here at the Café de Foy that a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins stood upon a table in a moment of quiet lightning and called for a revolution that would change the course of history. But in your mind, this scene is slow and silent, like a painting that moves only with the flickering of the candlelight. The revolution was not born in the streets, but was nurtured in the patience of the coffee house, where the caffeine sharpened the mind and allowed the citizens to imagine a world without a crown while the rest of the city lay under a heavy blanket of royal tradition. As you listen to the story, you can feel the stillness of the Parisian night settling over you like a heavy cloak, and the ideas of liberty and equality become as light as the foam on a cup of coffee drifting away into the dark rafters of the room. The coffee houses like the Café Procope and the Café de la Régence were the lungs of the city, where the breath of the people was transformed into the energy of change. But tonight those rooms are empty, and the chairs have been turned upside down on the tables, and the only sound is the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the mantel. The king and queen in their vast palace of Versailles are miles away, sleeping in beds of gold and silk, unaware that the simple act of drinking coffee has created a clarity of thought that will eventually knock at their very doors. There's profound peace in the realization that great movements start with a single quiet moment and a single shared cup, and as you sink deeper into the warmth of your own bed, you can feel the tension of the world dissolving into the shadows of the cafe walls. The revolution is a distant echo, now a story told in the pages of history books, while the actual rooms where it was planned had become silent and still and filled with the dust of the centuries. The marble tables are cool to the touch, and the silver spoons are resting in their trays, and the great fire on the hearth has burned down to a single orange ember that glows like a distant star in the darkness. You are walking to the empty Palais Royal now, and the gardens are silent, and the statues are watching over the night with stone eyes that have seen the rise and fall of empires, and yet they remain unmoved and calm. The world is returning to its rest, and the heat of the political debate has cooled into a soft and gentle breeze that carries the scent of rain and damp stone to the open windows. The downfall of the monarchy was a slow and deliberate process, like the steeping of tea or the roasting of bean, and now that the process is complete, the history can finally close its eyes and sleep, breathe in the stillness of the old city, and breathe out the energy of the day as you become part of the quiet architecture of the past where the only task is to listen to the silence and to let the weight of your body be supported by the earth. The Café de Foy is dark, and the candles have been snuffed out, and the ghosts of the revolutionaries have wandered back into the mist of Seine to find their own peace. The story of the coffee house is a story of awakening, but it leads inevitably to the deep and heavy rest that follows the work of the day. Sleep now as the city of Paris sleeps under the silver moon, and let the history of the world drift away like steam rising into the night air until there is nothing left but the quiet and the dark. In the quiet and misty harbors of 18th century New England, where the salt air of the Atlantic meets the cold breath of the forest, there was once a time when the rhythmic lapping of the tide against the wooden hulls of great merchant ships was the only sound to break the silence of the night. Imagine the town of Boston as it was in a place of narrow cobblestone streets and flickering lanterns with a scent of wood smoke, and dried fish hung heavy in the air, and the people moved with a deliberate and steady pace through the long winters. For generations, the tea leaf had been a staple of every colonial household, a symbol of comfort and a connection to the mother country across the sea. But slowly that simple dried leaf began to represent the heavy hand of a distant crown that sought to tax the rituals of the daily table, without the consent of those who poured the water. As the moon rose over the dark mass of the Dartmouth and the Eleanor and the Beaver, you can picture the quiet intensity of the men gathered in the shadows of the Old South meeting house, where the air was thick with new and restless energy that was as sharp as the sea spray. The tea tax was not just about the copper coins, but about the very identity of a people who were beginning to feel the first stirrings of a national soul that was distinct from the empire that had birthed it. On a cold December night, the harbor water was as black as ink and as still as a mirror reflecting the silver stars. Above, while a group of men moved with silent purpose toward the docks, their footsteps muffled by the dampness of the pier and their breath blooming in the frigid air like ghostly clouds. There was no shouting and no chaos in his memory, only the rhythmic creak of the block and tackle and the heavy thud of wooden chests being hauled onto the decks, where the only light came from the swaying lanterns of the watchmen. The sound of the hatchets breaking open the chest was a sharp and steady rhythm that echoed across the water, followed by the soft and continuous splash of 342 crates of fine Bohemian Hyson tea being surrendered to the salty depths of the harbor. As the tea leaves unfurled in the cold brine, they released their scent one last time, a faint and flowery aroma that drifted through the rigging of the ships before being swallowed by the vastness of the sea. This was the moment when the American identity began to shift away from the teacup and toward the coffee pot as a way to reject the influence of the old world and embrace the rugged independence of the new one. As you listen to the story of the tea being lost to the tide, you can feel the heavy weight of that history settling into the silt of the harbor floor where it lies undisturbed and peaceful under the weight of the centuries. The revolution was coming, but in this moment the town of Boston returned to its slumber, and the men went back to their homes through the quiet alleys where the snow began to fall in soft and heavy flakes that muffled the world in a white blanket of silence. The great ship sat empty and light in the water, swaying gently with the movement of the currents, while the fish swam through the dark tea leaves that carpeted the bottom of the bay like a strange and underwater forest. There is a profound stillness in the aftermath of a great event, and as you sink deeper into your own bed, you can feel that same quietness washing over you like a gentle wave that pulls you away from the shore of the waking world. The tea tax is a forgotten law, and the ships are ghosts of timber and iron, and the harbor is a place of absolute calm where the only clock is the rising and the falling of the moon. The colonies were growing into a nation, and the people were finding their own voice, But tonight that voice is a soft whisper that tells you there's nothing left to worry about and nowhere left to go. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a pile of soft gray ash in the wind, has died down to a gentle sigh that rattles the window pane just enough to remind you how warm and safe you are in the darkness. The story of the tea and the harbor is a story of beginning, but it ends in the deep and restorative rest of a world that has finally found its way. Let the image of the dark water and the white snow blend into a single wash of peaceful gray, until your thoughts are as light as the tea leaves drifting in the deep and your body is as heavy as the anchor resting in the mud. The world is at peace and the history is settled, and the night is yours to inhabit in total and perfect silence. The lanterns have all been snuffed out and the docks are empty, and the great harbor of Boston is dreaming of the ocean as you surrender to the deep and steady pull of a dreamless sleep. In the middle of the 19th century, when the world was vast and full of hidden corners, there lived a quiet and observant man named Robert Fortune, who was a Scottish botanist with a steady hand and a patient soul, and he was tasked by the East India Company with a mission so secret and so slow that it moved at the pace of the growing seasons. Imagine the jagged and misty mountains of the Fujian province in China, where the emerald tea bushes cling to the steep rocky slopes and the clouds, gather in the valleys like thick pools of milk-white silk. At this time, the secret of how to grow and process tea was a closely guarded treasure of the Chinese Empire, and no foreigner was permitted to travel deep into the interior, where the finest leaves were harvested and dried. Robert Fortune disguised himself in the long robes of a local merchant and shaved his head to blend into the landscape, moving like a shadow through the ancient villages where the air was thick with the scent of charcoal fires and damp earth. He traveled by foot and by riverboat along winding waterways where the only sound was the rhythmic splash of the oars and the soft rustle of the wind to the tall bamboo groves that lined the banks. His goal was to collect the seeds and the young saplings of the Camellia sinensis and to find a way to transport them across the sea to the rolling hills of Assam and Darjeeling in India, where the British hoped to break the ancient monopoly of the East. As you picture him carefully gathering the tiny brown seeds and packing them into glass Wardian cases, which were like miniature greenhouses designed to protect the delicate life. Within you can feel the immense patience required for such a journey. The seeds needed to be kept at a constant temperature and protected from the salt spray of the ocean as they were carried over high mountain passes on the backs of mules, and then onto the decks of wooden ships that swayed with slow and hypnotic motion across the wide indigo expanse of the sea. The transition of the tea plant from one continent to another was a silent and botanical heist that took years to complete, and yet it was done with the quiet precision of a gardener tending to a private flower bed. When the plants finally arrived in the mist-shrouded highlands of India, they found a new home in the cool mountain air that felt so much like the home they had left behind, and the first plantations began to grow in long and orderly rows that followed the curves of the earth like the fingerprint of a giant. The breaking of the monopoly did not happen with a loud crash, but with a slow and steady unfurling of new green leaves under the warm sun of the Himalayas and the quiet rustle of thousands of hands plucking the harvest in a rhythmic and timeless dance. The secret of the tea was no longer a secret, but a shared gift of the earth that began to flow into the markets of the world in a never-ending stream of silver and gold. As you listen to the story of this great robbery, you can feel the weight of the mountains and the coolness of the mist settling over your own mind like a soft and protective layer of silence. The high peaks of China are still there standing silent and unmoved by the passage of time, and the tea gardens of India are growing in the quiet darkness of the night, where the only light comes from the moon reflecting off the dew on the leaves. Robert Fortune has long since returned to his quiet study, and the East India Company has faded into the archives of history, and the great struggle for the leaf has ended in a world where tea is as common as the rain. There is a profound peace in the thought of plants traveling across the world to find a new place to rest, and as you sink deeper into the stillness of your own room, you can feel your thoughts traveling along those same ancient trade routes toward a destination of total and absolute calm. The Wardian cases are closed and the seeds have taken root, and the mission is over, and there is nothing left to do but watch the clouds move across the face of the moon in a slow and silent procession. The mountains are calling you to rest, and the river is whispering a lullaby of water and stone, and the air is filled with the faint and floral scent of a world that is finally at peace with itself. Sleep now as the tea bushes sleep in the dark mountain soil, and let the history of the great robbery become a dream of green hills and quiet gardens where the only sound is the breath of the wind. In the vast and rolling landscape of 19th century Brazil, where the red earth meets the endless horizon of the southern sky, there began a transformation of the landscape so profound and so slow that it moved with the steady inevitability of the changing seasons. Imagine the dense and ancient Atlantic rainforest where the air was once thick with the scent of wild orchids and the heavy dampness of 1,000 years of growth, but then slowly the sound of the axe and the rhythmic thud of the clearing began to echo through the valleys as the forest gave way to long and orderly rows of coffee trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. This was the beginning of the coffee boom, a period where the dark and oily bean transitioned from a rare luxury of European courts into a mass-market commodity that would fill the cupboards and the mugs of every working family in the rising cities of North America. The economy of South America was reshaped as the terra roxa, or the purple earth, proved to be the perfect cradle for the coffee plant, providing a nutrient-rich soil that allowed the beans to flourish in a way the world had never seen before. As you picture the vast fazendas or coffee estates, you can see the whitewashed walls of the manor houses sitting atop the hills, while below them the sea of green leaves sways in a gentle and hypnotic rhythm with the breeze. The work on these plantations was measured by the rising of the sun and the slow filling of heavy burlap sacks with the bright red cherries that were then spread out on massive stone drying floors to bake under the golden heat of the Brazilian sun. The sound of the beans being raked across the stone was a constant and soothing rasp, like the sound of a distant ocean tide pulling back from the shore, and as the beans dried they turned from a vibrant red to a pale parchment color, ready to be shipped across the world. To move this massive harvest to the coast, the first steam engines were brought to the continent, and the rhythmic chug and hiss of the locomotives began to replace the slow creak of the ox carts, creating a new and mechanical heartbeat for the region. The port of Santos became a bustling gateway where the air was thick with the rich and earthy aroma of millions of pounds of coffee waiting to be loaded into dark holds of steamships that would carry the energy of the south to the cold and hungry markets of the north. In the United States, the rise of the industrial worker and the long hours of the factory created a new need for a cheap and reliable source of alertness, and so the coffee from Brazil became the fuel for the modern age, turning the morning ritual into a universal experience that transcended class and geography. The landscape was no longer a wild jungle, but a productive and organized garden where every tree was a tiny engine of commerce, and every bean was a drop of potential energy waiting to be released in a white porcelain cup. As you listen to the story of this massive expansion, you can feel the heavy warmth of the Brazilian sun on your shoulders and the scent of the dry earth rising up to meet you like a dusty and comforting memory. The forests have retreated to the mountain peaks, and the hills are covered in a soft blanket of coffee leaves that shimmer like silk under the pale light of the moon, and the world has become a place of predictable cycles and steady growth. There's a profound peace in the thought of millions of people starting their day with the same simple brew, in a way a single plant could connect the rugged hills of Sao Paulo to the quiet breakfast tables of 1,000 cities. The boom was loud and energetic in its prime, but tonight the fazendas are quiet, and the steam engines have cooled, and the drying floors are empty and silver in the moonlight. The red earth is resting, and the roots of the trees are deep in the soil, drinking in the coolness of the night, and the only sound is the rustle of the leaves as they dream of the next harvest. You are walking to the rows of trees now, and the air is still, and the branches are heavy with the promise of future mornings, but there is no rush to reach them, because the night is long and the world is finally at peace with its own productivity. The economy of an entire continent was built on this one bean, but the bean itself is just a seed that wants to sleep in the dark earth, and you are like that seed tucked away in the warmth of your own room, far from the noise of the markets and the steam of ports. Let the image of the vast green hills of Brazil dissolve into a soft and hazy wash of emerald and gold until your mind is as quiet as a deserted plantation in the middle of the night. The world is fueled and the work is done, and the history of the bean has reached a place of quiet equilibrium where the only task left is to breathe and to drift into the deep and restorative darkness of a dreamless slumber. The ships have sailed and the rails are silent, and the red earth is holding you close in its ancient and steady embrace. In the heart of the 19th century, within the damp and fog-laden air of industrial England, there arose a group of families known as the Chocolate Kings, who were guided by a peculiar blend of Quaker faith and a vision of a sweeter world. Imagine the red brick factories of Bournville and York, where the air was constantly heavy with a thick and comforting scent of roasting cocoa beans, a smell so rich it seemed to coat the very cobblestones in a layer of velvet. these men like George Cadbury and Joseph Rowntree believed that their industry should be a force for good, and they built model villages with gardens and schools for their workers, thinking they could create a paradise of productivity within the gray smoke of the Victorian era. But as you settle into the stillness of your room, you can imagine the quiet moral weight that began to settle upon their shoulders when news began to drift back from the distant islands of Sao Tome and Principe off the coast of Africa, where the cocoa was grown. The chocolate kings found themselves in a silent and agonizing dilemma, because the very beans that produced their wholesome cocoa were being harvested by laborers working under conditions that mirrored the old slavery they had fought so hard to abolish. The story of the Cocoa Wars was not fought with cannons, but with ledgers and letters and long, quiet walks through the English countryside as these men wrestled with the ethics of a global supply chain that moved with the slow and heavy pace of a freight ship. They sent secret investigators to tropical plantations where the sun was fierce, and the labor was relentless to uncover the truth of how the sweet luxury of England was tied to the bitter reality of the colonies. As you listen to the steady rhythm of this history, you can feel the coolness of the English rain washing away the heat of the conflict and turning the world into a soft and monochromatic gray. The chocolate kings eventually had to choose between their profits and their principles, and their decision to boycott tainted cocoa was a slow and deliberate turning of the wheel of history that required immense patience and a willingness to stand alone in the quiet of the night. The factories in England continued to hum with a low and mechanical drone as the beans were ground into a fine powder and mixed with milk and sugar to create the bars that we still know today. But the spirit of the industry had been forever changed by the realization that no cup of chocolate is truly sweet if it is steeped in the shadows of injustice. Now those great Victorian factories are mostly silent or turned into museums, where the old copper vats sit like giant sleeping bells, and the scent of cocoa is just a faint and ghostly memory lingering in the rafters. The villages they built are still there with their neat rows of houses and their quiet parks where the trees sway in the evening breeze, and the world feels as if it has finally found a point of rest. The moral dilemmas of the past have been settled into the pages of dusty books, and the chocolate kings have long since gone to their reward, leaving behind a legacy of conscience in a world that is a little more aware of the threads that connect us all, breathe in the cool and damp air of a quiet English evening, and breathe out the complexities of the modern world. As you drift into a state of pure and unburdened calm, the ledger is balanced, and the investigation is closed, and the factories have snuffed out their lanterns for the night, leaving the cobblestones to the moonlight and the soft footsteps of the mist. You are no longer a part of the trade or the struggle for ethics, because you are resting in the sanctuary of the present moment, where the only reality is the softness of your pillow and the steady rise and fall of your breath. Let the image of the red brick towers and the green cocoa pods dissolve into a single hazy dream of a world where everything is fair and everyone is at peace. The story of the Chocolate Kings is a story of a long journey toward the light. But tonight, that light is just a dim and flickering candle that is slowly burning down to nothing. Sleep now as the gardens of Bourne will sleep, and let the weight of the world melt away like a piece of chocolate on the tongue, until there is nothing left but the silence and the dark. In the vast and echoing silence of history, where the rumble of heavy machinery and the distant thunder of the horizon once defined the waking lives of millions, there emerged a simple and portable ritual that would forever bind the American spirit to the dark and comforting essence of the coffee bean. Imagine a world covered in the gray mist of the early 20th century, where young men from the rolling plains of the Midwest and the crowded streets of Brooklyn found themselves far from home, huddled in damp trenches or the cold steel hulls of ships, where the only warmth to be found was in a small tin cup held between trembling fingers. During the First World War, the American government realized that the steady focus and quiet resolve of its soldiers was fueled not just by rations of bread and meat, but by the hot and bitter liquid that the men called their cup of joe, a name that became a synonym for the common man and his daily endurance. The demand for this liquid energy was so great that it sparked a revolution in how the bean was processed, leading to the birth of instant coffee, a fine and powdery substance that could be dissolved in a canteen of water over a small fire, even in the middle of a restless night. As you listen to the story, you can feel the heavy weight of the wool blankets and the rhythmic sound of the rain against the canvas tents as thousands of soldiers sat in the darkness waiting for dawn and find comfort in the steady steam rising from their cups By the time the Second World War swept across the globe, coffee had become an essential part of the military machine, and the government was purchasing millions of pounds of beans, ensuring that every soldier, from the paratrooper in the clouds to the mechanic in the mud, had access to the dark brew that kept the fog of exhaustion at bay. When these millions of G.I. Joes finally returned home to the quiet suburbs and the bustling cities of post-war America, they brought with them a deep and ingrained habit that would reshape the American kitchen forever. They had grown accustomed to the convenience of the instant powders and the reliable strength of the percolator, and soon the scent of brewing coffee became the official fragrance of the American morning, a signal that the work of the day was beginning, and that the world was safe and moving forward once again. The coffee companies of the 1950s began to fill the airwaves with the gentle bubbling sound of the glass pot on. The stove would sound so rhythmic and hypnotic that it became a lullaby for a nation that was finally at peace. Imagine the quiet of a modern American kitchen in the early morning light, where the sun is just beginning to touch the linoleum floors, and the only sound is the soft hiss of the water heating up and the rhythmic clinking of a spoon against a ceramic mug. The war was over and the great struggle for the world had ended, but the simple bean remained as a bridge between the intensity of the past and the comfort of the present. Coffee was no longer a luxury or a secret of the elite, but a democratic necessity shared by the office worker and the construction laborer and the tired parent in the middle of the night. As you sink deeper into the stillness of your own bed, you can feel the echoes of those distant wars fading into the background of time, leaving behind only the warmth and the familiarity of the ritual. The great troop ships have all returned to their harbors, and the uniforms have been folded away in cedar chests, and the world has settled into a long and steady rhythm of productivity and rest. There is a profound sense of security in knowing that the simple things like a cup of coffee have survived the storms of history to provide a point of constancy in our lives. And as you breathe in the cool night air, you can almost smell the faint and earthy aroma of a fresh brew drifting through the hallways of a house that is entirely at peace. The soldiers are grandfathers now, and the factories have shifted their gears, and the instant coffee tins are resting on the shelves of quiet pantries where the shadows are long and the world is still. You are no longer part of the march or the noise of the century, because you have reached the end of the day where the only task is to let the memories of the past dissolve into the velvet darkness of the night. The giant machines of war have been turned into the gentle tools of peace, and the energy of the caffeine has finally ebbed away to leave you in a state of soft and heavy relaxation. Let the story of G.I. Joe and his tin cup carry you into a place where there are no more alerts and no more deadlines, only the infinite and peaceful expanse of a dreamless sleep. The world is quiet, and the coffee is cold, and the history of the bean is tucked away in the shadows where it will wait for the morning light, while you drift further and further into the deep. In the quiet transition of the late 20th century, as the world began to move with a digital pulse, and the pace of life accelerated once again, there occurred a subtle and steady evolution in the way we touch the ancient traditions of the bean and the leaf. Imagine a cool and rainy morning in Seattle, where the fog clings to the Emerald Hills and the sound of the tide in Elliott Bay is a slow and rhythmic heartbeat that echoes through the streets of the Pike Place Market. It was here that the humble commodity of coffee began its transformation into a global lifestyle brand, where the dark roasted aroma became a sanctuary from the noise of the modern world, and the simple act of ordering a drink became a personal ritual whispered in a language of lattes and macchiatos. This was the birth of the third place of space that was not home and not work, but a neutral and warm territory filled with the sound of steaming milk and the low murmur of jazz and the rhythmic tamping of espresso. Grounds into silver baskets, the historical commodity that had once fueled the empires of the East and the plantations of the South was now being reimagined as a multi-billion-dollar daily experience that stretched from the glass towers of Manhattan to the quiet corners of Tokyo and the sun-drenched plazas of Rome. As you listen to the steady cadence of this evolution, you can feel the warmth of the coffee shop settling over your own mind like a soft and protective layer of steam that blurs the sharp edges of the day. The evolution did not happen with a sudden explosion, but with the slow and deliberate opening of thousands of green canopied stores where the interior was always consistent and the chairs were always comfortable and the lighting was always a dim and golden amber. The third wave of coffee brought a new focus on the origin of the bean and the precise temperature of the water, and the art of the pour-over, turning the kitchen counter into a laboratory of flavor and the morning routine into a meditative practice that required patience and focus. Tea followed a similar path as the ancient traditions of the East were packaged into elegant tins and colorful sachets that promise a moment of zen in a world that never stopped moving, while chocolate evolved from a childhood treat into a high. Percentage cocoa experience that was meant to be savored one slow and dark square at a time. The brands became symbols of identity and belonging. And as the green sirens and golden leaves appeared on every street corner, the world began to feel smaller and more connected to the shared language of the cup. But in the quiet of the night, these global giants are just shadows on the sidewalk, and the bustling counters are wiped clean, and the espresso machines have fallen into a deep and metallic silence. The multi-billion-dollar ritual has reached its pause for the night, and the millions of people who participated in it are now tucked away in their own homes, feeling the caffeine leave their systems and the natural weight of the evening take its place. You can picture the empty shops with their polished counters and their neatly stacked cups standing like silent monuments to the day's productivity, while the moon reflects off the large glass windows and the city outside is still. There is a profound peace in knowing that no matter how much the world changes, the simple act of holding a warm cup is a constant that anchors a human spirit to the earth. And as you sink deeper into the softness of your own bed, you can feel that anchor holding you steady in the sea of sleep. The lifestyle brands and the global marketing are just noise on the surface of a deep and quiet ocean of history. And at the bottom of that ocean is the same stillness that the Sufi monks felt in the mountains of Yemen and the same calm that the Aztecs felt in the jungles of Mexico. The evolution is complete and the commodity has become a companion. But tonight, even that companion is resting, and the world is free to simply exist without the need for energy or focus. Breathe in the cool and filtered air of the night, and breathe out the complexities of the modern brand, as you find a place of absolute simplicity and quiet, where there are no logos and no prices, only the feeling of being supported by the universe. The great machine of the global economy has slowed to a crawl, and the lights in the skyscrapers are being turned off one by one, and the streets are being handed back to the mist and the silence. You are drifting through a world where every drink is a memory and every ritual is a lullaby, and the only destination is the deep and restorative sleep that has been waiting for you since the sun went down. Let the image of the bustling cafe dissolve into a soft and hazy dream of quiet. Library or a hidden garden where the only sound is the breath of the wind and the only clock is the slow rotation of the earth. The ritual of the day is over and the ritual of the night has begun, and you are exactly where you are meant to be in the heart of the stillness. As the long journey of the bean and the leaf reaches its final chapter, in the twilight of the modern age, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a vast and quiet horizon, where the future of these ancient drinks is being written in the soil and the wind and the changing rhythm of the clouds. Imagine the high mountain slopes of the coffee belt, where the air is beginning to warm, and the delicate trees that have provided the world's energy for centuries are searching for the cool shadows of higher altitudes. The world is now engaged in a slow and persistent fight to preserve the very drinks that build our civilizations, as farmers and scientists move with a quiet and steady determination to adapt to a planet that is shifting beneath their feet. This final movement of our story is not one of loud battles, but the soft rustle of new resilient seedlings being planted in the red earth and the steady hum of a global conversation about fair trade and the ethics of the harvest. Imagine a quiet meeting in a remote village in Colombia or Ethiopia where the air is thin and the scent of wild jasmine is heavy, and the people are working together to ensure that the earth remains a sanctuary for the plants they love. The challenge of sustainability is a long and patient labor that requires us to look back at the history of the plantation and the monopoly and choose a path of balance and restoration where every cup is a promise to the future. As you listen to the steady cadence of this concluding thought, you can feel the immense scale of the effort becoming a soothing and distant drone that invites your mind to release its grip on the worries of the world. The fair trade movement is like a slow and steady tide that is lifting the boats of the small farmers and the cooperatives, ensuring that the sweetness of the chocolate and the warmth of the tea are no longer tied to the shadows of the past, but to a bright and equitable morning. The fight for the cup is a quiet one taking place in a laboratory where new varieties are being born, and in the hearts of consumers who choose to pause and think about the journey of the bean before they take their first sip. But tonight the fields are silent and the research is paused and the vast global network of trade is resting under a blanket of stars that do not change regardless of the era. The earth is a living and breathing entity that is slowly adjusting its own internal clock, And as you sink into the deep and supportive warmth of your own bed, you can feel yourself harmonize with that ancient and planetary rhythm. There's a profound peace in the realization that we are all caretakers of these simple treasures, and that the drinks that reshaped empires are now teaching us how to be better citizens of the world. The story of coffee, tea, and chocolate has traveled through monasteries and palaces and warships and factories to arrive here at this moment of absolute stillness and contemplation. The future is a quiet garden that is currently sleeping under the moonlight waiting for the sun to rise, but the sun is many hours away and the darkness is a vast and friendly ocean that is carrying you further and further from the shores of the day. The struggle for sustainability is a task for the waking world, but in the world of dreams the trees are already healthy, and the water is clean, and the people are at peace with the land. Let the image of the green hills and the dark soil dissolve into a soft and hazy wash of charcoal and indigo until there is nothing left to solve and nothing left to preserve. The cup is empty and the story is told, and the history of civilization is just a long and winding path that has led you to this single point of total relaxation. The empires have fallen and the brands have faded, and the climate is a mystery for tomorrow, while tonight the only reality is the softness of the air and the weight of your own limbs as they surrender to the pull of the earth. The earth is holding you just as it holds the roots of the coffee tree and the tea bush and the cacao pod in a steady and eternal embrace that knows no time and no worry. Breathe in the scent of the rain on the distant mountains and breathe out the last lingering thoughts of a century as you become one with the silence of the night. The preservation of the cup is a labor of love that is now. Tucked away in the shadows of the sleeping mind where the only movement is the slow and rhythmic breath of a world at rest, the story is finished and the cycle is complete and the journey is ended in the quietest place of all. Sleep now as the mountains sleep, and as the oceans sleep, and as the future sleeps in the quiet heart of the present moment.